Funmaster Mike is here to show you Shreyas versus Tani in Trafalgar Square on the big screen. Shreyas in person, Tani at home in New York. And here we go. We're going to skip the opening. We're going to pick it up in this position where Shreyas, wearing that nice ChessKid hat, plays h4, and he's got checkmate on the brain. Now, a lot of pawn moves were the big deciders in this game, and I think Tani should play pawn h5 to stop that h-pawn from moving. That's certainly what I would do. You lose control of the g5 square, but I'd rather give a square than allow an open file to happen. So Tani's got that St. Louis Chess Club hat on. You can see him focusing. Shreyas takes a quick sip of his chess power juice. Tani is focused, and actually Shreyas is already up about a minute. So Tani played h6, which is not as good of a move. I think h5 is a little better. Now after h5, Tani immediately plays g5. I might have played king h7 there. Notice the f5 square is super weak. That was a very committal decision. But they're playing 5+1. The moves have to come in quickly. Now, Tani gets his knight to a nice square. And this is a well-known idea. Tani is going to allow his knight to get captured, take back away from the center. My coach taught me this too, because I was a King's Indian defense player when I was a kid. And the knight hops back to d6, a very well-known pattern. However, look at Shreyas' knights. Both are poised for the f5 square. And in this position, I think maybe Shreyas should take his time getting his knights to f5. He spends a little bit of time on the clock here. Would you plop a knight to f5 right away? You know what you might want to do? You might want to figure out a way to trade bishops. Some idea like bishop g4 or something. Now, by hopping the knight in right away, that knight is too strong. Tani's going to take twice. And after taking twice, here comes the star move. I'm actually going to have you guys pause. Oh, nope, Tani played it too quickly. Don't bother pausing. Pawn to e4. He sacrifices a pawn to open up his bishop and the rook, a very thematic idea, and I love it. That move, pawn e4, it happened so quick we can barely even go back to it, but that was probably the star move of the game. After allowing e4, Shreyas is going to be back on his heels for the rest of the game. Notice he was not able to castle there, because if he did, he would have lost his bishop. So what does Shreyas do about this horrible pin on the king? Well, he tries to hide his king on f1, castling by hand, not a bad idea. Now, black is technically down a pawn, although white's extra pawn is, which one is it? The one on f5? It's really the activity of Tani's dark squared bishop that gives the advantage. As we always say, including my ChessKid video, opposite colored bishop middle games always favor the attacker because you simply have one extra attacker. I'm not sure about f6. It weakens a couple of light squares. They may not seem important to you, but surprisingly, the H file is going to open. I would say that's foreshadowing, but foreshadowing is when you give a subtle hint. I basically told you what's going to happen. Yeah, that's right. I'm not commentating on this game live, although I was there in person. If you happen to see me in the background of Shreyas' video, well, your eyes do not deceive you. I was there in the background. Okay, so bishop d3. Now, Tani's taking a little bit of thought. How does he increase the pressure? Remember what we always say? When you can't figure out what to do, improve your worst piece. Well, Tani's got a rook on a8. What's that rook doing? Nothing. That rook is waiting for the G train. For those of you that have ever lived in Brooklyn or Queens, you know the G train's a little slow. Okay, queen to f4. And, Shreyas here, he would love to take all the pieces off the board that are heavies, the queens and the rooks. He probably would not be winning, but the worst would be behind him. Okay, he plays rook b1. Now the b pawn is unpinned. He's probably thinking about maybe a3 or b4. I don't know. It's a little bit optimistic. He does get the pawn out of harm's way, so at least he doesn't have to babysit that pawn anymore. And how is Tani going to increase the pressure? There's no mate on f2. The queen on c2 defends it. If there was a way to deflect the queen, that would be nice. Unfortunately, there is probably not a way. Okay, clocks are ticking down, but both players still have about 3 minutes. By the way, this is game 2. They drew game 1 of their match. That was an exciting game in its own regard. Now, Tani plays rook e5. It actually was better to go to e7 to double the rooks. You may not think that there's a big difference, but notice Tani's bishop no longer defends the f6 pawn. That's going to be the subject of something we talk about in just a moment. Okay, at this point in the video, I'd like you to pause. We are paused. Here, white is clearly worse. If you don't know that, well, I've been telling you that the whole game. There's actually a way that Shreyas can bail out basically into a forced draw. Not 100% forced, but essentially a forced draw. Can you find it? Okay, remember all the different drawing ideas. Stalemate, well, there's no stalemate here, but don't forget repeating the position 3 times. Okay, let's go back to our game and see what Shreyas did here to, it looked like, bail out into a draw. Okay, still thinking. By the way, it should also be mentioned that it was about 32 degrees Celsius, 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Shreyas was in the hot sun, and that guy behind Shreyas is actually holding an umbrella. I'm not kidding. Okay, so rook f3. Did you find that move? If you did, maybe your name is Shreyas. Or maybe you're as good as Shreyas, our new FM. And look, he just toggles the rook back and forth. It looks like it's going to be a draw, which is not bad when you're worse. This is one of the ideas when you are worse in a chess game. Better to get a half point than 0 points. Okay, now Tani's like, wait a minute. Is there any way I can continue this game without getting in the same position 3 times? Remember, it doesn't have to be 3 times in a row. Okay, now Tani's going to capture this pawn if my memory serves correct. And when he captures, now it's a different position because the pawn's missing. Uh-oh, but wait a minute. The trick has not gone away. Now, technically, the queen can go back to f7, which is why I said this was not a forced draw, but the queen is passive on f7 or e8. And then Shreyas would have collected the h-pawn. Okay, now in this position, Shreyas can actually just keep going back and forth with his rook. Even though the h-pawn is missing, he can keep on repeating the position. Now, Tani, I'm guessing he would have brought his queen back to f7 eventually to avoid the draw. But then when Shreyas takes the pawn, imagine the queen being on f7 here. It would be much worse. However, Shreyas, he knows what the crowd wants. He's a strong enough player. He knows he could have made a draw. But in this position, he went and took the h-pawn. I'll bet you in a classical tournament game, he would have taken the draw. But, you know, he wanted to put on a show for the fans. The fans don't come to see 2 draws. So kudos to Shreyas for playing this one out. Okay, he's still worse. He got his pawn back. Now, the f6 pawn, you can see it's a little bit weak in this position. But if it gets captured, then there's a possibility of a discovered attack on his rook. So instead, he brings his queen back to the square d1. He is desperately trying to trade queens. Now, Tani's the attacker. I'll bet you know he does not want to trade queens. So let's see what Tani does here. Is he going to trade? Is he going to move the queen away? Okay, Tani moves, and let's pause. Quick pause of our videos there. This is another key position. And I can't read Shreyas's mind, but if I could, I would probably be thinking what he's thinking, what I'm thinking he's thinking, which is, wait a minute, I have another chance at a draw. That's right, chess kids. Another repetition could happen here. Do you see it? Turns out, rook h8 check, an amazing rook sacrifice leads to a draw. Because when the king takes the rook, you play queen h5 check. And when the king moves back to the g file, queen g6 check. And if the king moves to the f file, you can take on f6 because the rook on e5 blocks the bishop. I told you that was going to be important. So rook h8 check leads to a forced draw. And by the way, if the king tries to avoid taking the rook can just keep on checking on the h file. So I don't think there's any way out of it. Now, did Shreyas see that? Okay, I'll be honest, I can't read his mind. He may have been thinking, again, I'm here, I'm in front of my countrymen, we got a big crowd in Trafalgar Square. I'm going to be like Churchill in triumph. I don't know. Maybe he saw it, maybe he did. Maybe he just wanted to play some more chess. Let's unpause and go back to the game. Okay. Instead, he tries to get the queens off the board. He accepts the fact that he's going to get tripled pawns. That's how much he wants the queens off the board. In fact, if the queens trade, he'll take back with the g-pawn. He'll march his king to g2. He'll double rooks on the h-file. He might mate with 2 rooks. So queen takes queen not only would get rid of Tani's attack, it might catapult Shreyas's attack on the h-file. Okay, but you know, Tani, he wants to keep the queens on the board. And we got a mate threat. We have a mate alert on the square e1, but a little timeout is in order. This, I didn't even see. I was watching this game live. If you mentally put the queen back on f4, I have a secret to tell you, chess kids. There was forced mate. There was actually forced mate. It begins. Again, we're pretending the queen's back on f4. Rook e1 check. That's why you always look at your checks and captures, chess kids. Rook e1 check. All of the rooks leave the board, which means Tani lost a rook. When the king takes back on e1, the amazing bishop c3 check, followed by queen c1. And a back rank checkmate is going to happen. It is amazing. Go back, set up a chessboard, play it out. It was actually mate, and I think 5 moves for Tani. Unbelievable. He doesn't miss many, but he only had 2 minutes on his clock. And honestly, the move he made looks more logical, right? He's just going for a regular checkmate on e1, and he may have thought it was unstoppable. Who knows? Now, in this position, I do believe this rook h8 trick still works. Yeah, I believe it does. Okay, so Shreyas, I think here definitely should have bailed out into a repetition with rook h8. Okay, let's go back to our game. Instead, checkmate on e1. You could just parry this threat through some sort of normal means. Can't play rook d1 because rook e1 still leads to a mate. So Shreyas has shielded the sun and shielded his king from checkmate by playing g3, giving his king Luft, or Luft, if you are one of my German friends. Okay, now how does Tani break through? He still has to worry about this counterplay on the h file. Oh, and he's talking to himself there. Yeah, we had the microphones muted, but he's saying, I'm Tani, I got this. And you know a player is serious when their head is no longer in the screen. He's leaning forward so much, all we can see is the top of his hat. Okay, we got blue versus gray here. The blue-gray game. And what is he going to do? He's going to play rook e3. I did not see this move coming. Yeah, I think at this point I was talking with I Am Malcolm Payne and Grandmaster Stuart Conquest, and we were both like, rook e3. I would say we jumped out of our seats, but we were standing. So there was a fountain. We jumped in the fountain? No. By the way, rook h8 no longer works because the king can walk back to the f file and the f6 pawn is guarded. So rook h8 check no longer works. Taking the rook allows queen takes bishop, forking the king and the rook. So that's obviously a problem. But if you just move your queen, queen takes bishop check anyway. So you might need to take the rook here instead of playing queen h5. However, it's a little bit of a question if you play queen h5. Can he really take your bishop and your rook, or will he self-mate? Will black fall into a checkmate? I think black has some ways of getting out of that with check. I won't get into all the different variations, but just to let you know. Okay, now comes the critical time. Shreyas is down to less than a minute. Less than a minute. He does take the rook. I think that I understand the decision. Okay, so he's going to lose his bishop and his rook, but he's very close to a checkmate. Again, the rook h8 sacrifice, that idea never works anymore because Tani's bishop guards f6. Okay, now Tani's draining his clock because when you're in a position like this, even though it might look like the white king is busted, you have so many checks and captures that you've got to analyze them all. Okay, he takes with the rook, forcing the queen to move, but g3 is weak. So if you tried to make a battery on the h-file, you might get mated on the third rank. That is the problem for Shreyas here. If you dive in with queen h5, which he plays, rook takes g3 could be a massive problem. Now again, Tani is not moving right away because here he could check on the second rank with 3 different queen moves. He could check with the rook on the second rank, or he could play rook takes g3. But I can guarantee you one thing, he's going to play a check. Because if he doesn't, he's probably going to get mated himself. It's mate in 2 for white if white had a free move. So queen takes rook would be very bad for Tani because rook h8 check followed by queen h7 check would be mate in 2. Okay, and Tani checks with his rook. The king hides on h3, but queen takes pawn check. Uh-oh. Now Tani would like to play g4, but queen f3 would be mate, so he blocks with the queen. But then rook h2 deflecting the king away. Game is still not over, even though Tani has won a queen. Because queen versus 2 rooks is interesting. Now, with the extra bishop, of course black is better. Queen and bishop should be better than 2 rooks. However, if there's a way to coordinate those rooks, that could be a problem. Okay, now Shreyas is trying to get both rooks on the same file and just check the king back and forth and make a draw. But he can't quite get those rooks coordinated. And in fact, Tani's got a way for his king to crawl out to the f5 square. So even if the rooks coordinate on the h file or the 8th rank, Tani's king can always walk to g6 and f5. Okay, both players down to about 15 seconds or less. The rooks still can't coordinate. Okay, they can coordinate on the 7th rank, but again, the problem is the f5 square. And in this position, how can Tani deal with the checks? Well, he puts his queen on d1, which gives him options to check the white king. Okay, check, king moves. Now he just wants to be able to put his king on h3 or f3 and play g4 mate. Okay, he plays basically a waiting move. Now here he should move his king somewhere besides f3. He's trying to go for a mate with pawn g4. Oh, but he gets mated on f2 first. You completely understand why he put his king on f3. He wanted to play pawn g4 mate, but he walks into a checkmate himself. Honestly, Shreyas was already worse. You can't blame him for going for a mate with 7 seconds on his clock. But what an exciting battle. That was on a giant screen, I don't know, maybe 10 meters wide. Right in London, and when that checkmate happened on the board, can I say the crowd went wild? I don't know. I mean, I guess the crowd would have probably preferred the hometown UK talent Shreyas to win, but these two kids are awesome talents. They put on quite a show. Kudos to them both. Tani found some great tactics. Shreyas, I know he knows that he had some draws, but he wanted to put on a show for the fans, I think. So just an awesome performance, and I think we need to have these guys play a little bit of a longer match. What do you think? Yeah. I think so. Look forward to more chess from both of them on ChessKid very soon.